violence is not the way. We are hit, we've got to learn not to hit back.
The main thrust of the black movement has always been nonviolent, and of course that's represented ultimately so well in the struggles of Martin Luther King Jr. Remember, one of the things that stirred up the American people to redress some of the wrongs is watching television and seeing a lot of the whites in the South clobbering black children and setting dogs on children and so on who were trying to go to school.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles.
By August 1965, with the Watts Rebellion, you do get something relatively new. You get a level of black self-assertion in the form of violent rebellion that it becomes offensive rather than defensive. I think what you have there is rising expectations being frustrated and hopes being broken and dreams being deferred and the rage spilling over in a violent manner. But alongside that, one still has everyday violence in the black community in which most black criminal activity is targeted to black victims. Unfortunately, of course, that everyday violence has been increasing and reaching absurd levels.
If you look at urban, poor communities, you usually find communities with very high homicide rates. It seems, because obviously most poor people are not violent, it seems that the stress and anxiety of poverty, coupled with maybe greater television watching, coupled with maybe the lack of an adult male parent for some of those children, seems to contribute to those risk factors.
Over the last 30 years, inner-city blacks, comprising less than 3% of the nation's total population, have committed nearly half of all murders. And most of the victims of violent crime also are black and poor. African Americans are murdered at 5 times the rate of whites.
Will blacks kill each other annually than were killed in the entire history of lynchings? It is settling disproportionately on the poor, on African Americans. We must break this cycle.
It's no accident that we've seen the escalation of black-on-black homicide, given the shattering of bonds of affection and networks of support. White supremacy, male supremacy in terms of domestic abuse has to do with mean-spiritedness and cold-heartedness. And there's no doubt that we have seen an increase of the mean-spiritedness and cold-heartedness in American civilization.
It is now recognized that for generations, behind a portrait of marital bliss, all too often lurked men with short tempers and violent tendencies. Americans didn't invent violence against women, but they took to it with vengeance. In Puritan New England, women were routinely whipped and publicly humiliated. Married women were little more than the property of their husbands. For generations, Americans have reported more domestic abuse than any other industrial nation. Alcohol, the catalyst for so much violence in American history, surfaced again. Women actually prayed in front of saloons in an effort to close them down, after the temperance movement made the connection linking alcohol abuse with domestic violence. Still, there were no laws in place to stop abusive, alcoholic husbands.
One night, I was on my post and I heard a woman shouting, "Murder!" I went to the house. She had been beaten by her husband, who was lying on the floor, half drunk. All I could do was caution the man to keep quiet, and then I left the place.
Well into the 1800s, a legal formula known as the rule of thumb allowed men to beat their wives as long as the sticks they used were no wider than their thumbs. Courts refused to break into what they called the sanctity of the domestic circle.
The law permits husbands to use such a degree of force as necessary to control an unruly temper and make a wife behave herself. If no permanent injury has been reflected, it is better to draw the curtain, shut out the public gaze, and leave the parties to forget and forgive.
All along, there has been a high level of family violence. Historically, the legal attitude has ranged from complete apathy to complete endorsement. More women now seek treatment in our nation's emergency rooms as a result of domestic violence injuries than from the combination of muggings, rapes, and car accidents, which makes domestic violence the #1 cause of injury to women in this country.
He told me that he was going to beat the fuck out of me, that he was going to take my kids from me to where I would never see them again, and that he would make my life so miserable that I would wish daily that I was dead. I told him that I didn't want to die. And
what was he saying to you?
He told me he was doing it because he loved me.
Just 2 years after making her videotaped accusation, Lisa Bianco was beaten to death by her estranged husband. In America, women are twice as likely to be murdered by former husbands or boyfriends than by strangers. If the video is shocking enough, like this scene of a husband's fatal attack on his ex-wife, it makes it onto evening newscasts nationwide. But the hallmark of domestic violence is that it occurs behind closed doors and gets no attention. No group of Americans is immune to it. Domestic abuse crosses all class lines and affects all races.
Most batterers do not beat up the police officer who gives them a speeding ticket. They don't beat up their boss who yells at them for being late. They beat up their partner and or their children because we let them.
My mommy and daddy are having a fight. Is she getting hurt?
Today we know that the great majority of men who beat their wives also beat their children. It is now recognized as the oldest and most common way that American violence is passed from one generation to the next. In a long tradition of taking out aggression on those who are less powerful, children have always been at risk. But in the past, the public preferred to ignore what went on in the privacy of the home. And the media also avoided the subject of child abuse, so that historical reports of family violence are very rare. The first documented case of incest and child abuse appeared in the 1795 memoirs of Abigail Bailey. Published upon her death, Bailey's frank descriptions were a pioneering effort to open America's closed doors. She told in detail how her husband made sexual advances toward his daughter. When he was rebuffed, he became uncontrollably violent.
One day, he fell to whipping her without mercy, striking her over her head, hands, and back. Nor did he spare her face, declaring that if she attempted to run from him, he would whip her to death.
Even though Bailey repeatedly raped his daughter, in the 18th century, prosecuting such crimes was next to impossible. And Bailey, like countless other husbands and fathers, was never brought to justice.